For 12 grueling years, my life as a senior international investigator for the International Conservation Coalition had been defined by sweltering Southeast Asian rainforests, corrupt border outposts, and tracking brutal illegal wildlife trafficking syndicates across 4 continents. At 37, I was a woman trained to read deception in the subtlest twitch of a criminal's jaw. Surviving in hostile environments where a single misstep meant fatal exposure. The high-stakes surveillance operation in Thailand was scheduled to drag on for another week, but through sheer, relentless focus, my team gathered irrefutable evidence early, collapsing the ring and leading to 17 high-profile arrests. Instead of celebrating in Bangkok, I immediately caught an emergency military transport flight back to the United States, driven by a fierce, protective, maternal urgency that surpassed every professional obligation. I had missed 3 of my son Matthew's birthdays over the past 5 years due to overseas deployments, an agonizing emotional sacrifice that weighed heavily upon my spirit. But not this year. Not his 9th birthday. As the aircraft touched down in rural Pennsylvania at 9 o'clock on a humid July evening, the night air carried the sweet, familiar scent of oak and damp summer earth. I felt a rare, golden warmth blossoming in my chest, picturing Matthew's tender, artistic face lighting up when he saw me walking through the front door. I had spent over a decade protecting defenseless creatures in distant wildernesses, but my heart's true compass had always pointed home to the gentle, soft-spoken boy who gave my life its deepest, most sacred purpose. Pulling into the gravel driveway of our suburban home, the structure stood completely shrouded in darkness, save for the single porch lamp glowing softly on an automated timer. The moment I turned the brass key and stepped across the threshold, an unsettling, heavy stillness greeted me that instantly set my trained investigator instincts on high alert. The living room was unnaturally pristine, far too immaculate, ordered, and sterile for a lively home raising a vibrant 9-year-old boy. There were no wooden building blocks scattered across the rug, no half-finished watercolor paintings drying on the coffee table, and no comic books tucked beside the sofa cushions. The quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow, cold, and utterly wrong to my soul. Moving methodically through the hallway, with the quiet precision I used when inspecting an abandoned poacher's camp, I pushed open the master bedroom door. My husband Richard's closet hung half empty, his heavy leather coats, work suits, and travel bags completely missing from their shelves. Walking further down the corridor into Matthew's bedroom, my breath caught painfully in my throat as my stomach dropped. His bed was made with tight, rigid hospital corners, a sharp, clinical style my creative son would never manage on his own. The wooden shelves holding his favorite sketchbooks were cleared, and his cherished stuffed bear was nowhere to be seen. The entire house felt stripped of its soul, echoing with a haunting emptiness that made every single nerve ending in my body tingle with an ominous, rising dread for my son's safety. Stepping into the dark kitchen, my flashlight beam caught a handwritten note left on the granite countertop under a glass jar. Glancing at Richard's hurried handwriting, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. Taking Matthew camping with your father Dale at his forest cabin. Back Tuesday. Don't worry. My eyes narrowed as cold, razor-sharp anger ignited beneath my skin. Tuesday was 4 long days away, and Matthew absolutely despised wilderness camping. Instantly, the painful memory of our bitter argument before my deployment to Thailand resurfaced in my mind with terrifying clarity. Richard had aggressively insisted on sending Matthew to a controversial wilderness therapy program recommended by my father, Dale Hobbs, a remote camp designed to forcibly toughen up young boys deemed too soft or emotional. I had shut the idea down with fierce, uncompromising authority. Matthew was a gentle, artistic soul who wept when he saw injured birds, a sensitive child who would be psychologically shattered by some ruthless military-style boot camp. He needs discipline, Julia. Richard had shouted back then, his face flushed with anger, resentment, and impatience. He cries over everything. He refuses to play football. And your father says he's turning out weak. I don't care what Dale says. I had cut him off coldly. Matthew is fine. He's 9 years old. Let him be 9. Standing alone in the dark kitchen, those past words echoed like a tragic warning, revealing that Richard had betrayed my explicit boundary the very moment my plane left American soil for Thailand. Without wasting a single precious second, I grabbed my heavy tactical go bag from the trunk of my vehicle, a durable nylon duffel never fully unpacked from years of field surveillance work in international jungles. Dale Hobbs was a retired Army veteran who owned a secluded hunting cabin 3 hours north, buried deep within thick state forest land. I had visited the remote property twice in the past, both times leaving with a profound sense of disgust at how my father glorified brute dominance and treated any display of human vulnerability with utter contempt. Sprinting back to my SUV, I slammed my foot onto the gas pedal and headed north into the gathering night. The humid July heat quickly broke into a violent, torrential thunderstorm, heavy sheets of rain battering my windshield as I navigated winding, unlit rural roads. Within the first hour of driving, the digital display on my phone lost cellular signal completely, cutting me off from all communication with the outside world. By midnight, I was steering by muscle memory alone down a rutted, muddy dirt track that snaked through dense, oppressive pine forests. Lightning flashed dramatically across the ink-black sky, illuminating towering pine trees that seemed to press in from all sides of the narrow road. Every professional survival instinct I had honed while tracking dangerous poachers across international borders burned with razor-sharp intensity, warning me that I was racing directly into a dark, predatory trap in the woods. As the dense pine forest cleared into a small opening, the darkened silhouette of Dale's remote cabin emerged through the torrential downpour. Killing my headlights several hundred yards away, I glided out of the SUV into the thick mud, my movements completely silent, as my body transitioned seamlessly into full tactical reconnaissance mode. Heavy rain soaked through my jacket, but I felt no cold, only a laser-focused, protective adrenaline surging through my blood. Dale's heavy pickup truck sat parked near the clearing, mud-splattered and empty, with no sign of Richard's sedan anywhere on the property. Crouching low beneath the shadow of the tree line, I navigated silently around the east side of the cabin, my eyes adjusting swiftly to the pitch-black environment. Suddenly, a sound cut through the steady drumming of the rain. A muffled, hoarse, rhythmic sobbing that sent an icy shiver straight down my spine. Flicking my tactical flashlight beam toward the rear of the property, the narrow cone of light revealed a horror so grotesque it shattered my heart into 1,000 sharp fragments. Chained to a massive oak tree 20 feet behind the cabin was my son, Matthew. He wore only thin shorts, barefoot and shivering violently in the mud. The heavy iron shackle around his small ankle was scraped raw, his frail body covered in angry welts and hundreds of mosquito bites. In that devastating moment, the devoted mother and the seasoned investigator merged into an unshakable, relentless force of nature, ready for battle. The narrow beam of my tactical flashlight sliced through the heavy sheet of falling rain, illuminating a scene of such unbearable cruelty that the air was violently sucked from my lungs. There, at the base of a towering, ancient oak tree, 20 feet behind the cabin, my 9-year-old son Matthew was chained like a wild animal. He wore only thin cotton shorts, his bare chest shivering violently against the freezing mud, his small, fragile frame covered in hundreds of swollen, inflamed mosquito bites and angry purple welts from exposed cold nights. A thick steel chain wrapped twice around the rough bark of the tree trunk, terminating in a heavy iron padlock that clamped tightly around his left ankle, cutting deep into his raw, bleeding skin. The sight shattered something fundamental inside me, releasing a surge of primal, protective, maternal fury that burned hotter than any emotion I had ever felt in my 37 years of life. Dropping to my knees in the freezing mud beside him, I cradled his pale, wet face in my trembling hands, my thumb gently brushing away tears that mixed with the torrential rainwater on his hollow cheeks. "Matthew, baby, it's Mommy. I'm right here," I choked out, my voice cracking with an unbearable blend of maternal anguish and fierce, unshakable devotion. He lifted his heavy eyelids, his wide brown eyes wild with disorientation, before recognizing me, a raspy, heartbreaking croak escaping his cracked lips as he whispered, "Mommy, you came back. Please don't let them hurt me anymore." Without losing a single precious second, I reached into my tactical belt and retrieved my heavy-duty multi-tool, my fingers moving with swift, practiced precision as I worked at the rusted iron padlock binding my son's ankle. My hands trembled with a fierce, quiet rage, but my mind remained razor-sharp, drawing upon 12 years of field experience, disarming intricate poacher traps in remote international jungles. Within moments, the steel mechanism gave way with a sharp metallic click, releasing the cruel iron shackle from his swollen, bloodied leg. As the heavy chain slithered into the dark mud, Matthew's weak body collapsed forward, completely unable to support his own weight after 3 agonizing days of forced isolation in a single position. I scooped his frail, weightless body up into my arms, pressing his cold, shivering face against the warm crook of my neck while wrapping him tightly in my insulated rain jacket. He felt impossibly light, all sharp ribs and delicate bones, his tiny fingers clutching my collar with surprising, desperate strength, as if terrified I might vanish back into the dark, stormy night. "I've got you, baby. You're safe now," I whispered repeatedly into his damp, muddy hair, kissing his forehead with fierce, protective tenderness. Through his shuddering sobs, Matthew leaned close to my ear, his raspy voice barely audible over the drumming rain, as he whispered urgently, "Mommy, there's a little girl locked in the wooden shed behind us. I heard her crying for her mother every single night." Leaving Matthew safely locked inside my SUV, with a warm thermal blanket and fresh drinking water, I drew my tactical knife and sprinted toward the dilapidated wooden shed tucked behind the cabin. The heavy wooden door was secured with a thick iron padlock, which I swiftly sheared through using the heavy bolt cutters retrieved from the bed of Dale's pickup truck. Pushing the creaking door open, the nauseating stench of stale sweat, damp mold, and sheer human terror hit my nostrils, instantly triggering every investigative instinct within me. Sitting curled in the far corner on a pile of filthy, mildewed blankets was a young girl who appeared no older than 12, her dark hair matted with grime and her thin arms heavily bruised. As my flashlight beam illuminated her terrified face, she let out a piercing shriek, pressing her back flat against the rough wooden wall in blind panic. "Shh, sweet girl, it's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you," I said gently, lowering my posture and keeping my voice soft, calm, and soothing as I stepped closer. "My name is Julia. I'm a mother, and I just rescued my son outside. What's your name?" "Sophia. Sophia Morrison," she whimpered through shuddering sobs. "Please don't tell him I talked. He said he'd break me like the others." Sophia revealed through trembling tears that her stepfather had paid Dale Hobbs to enroll her in a secret, abusive wilderness rehabilitation program designed to break rebellious children, revealing that Dale operated a clandestine network of similar torture camps spanning multiple states. After safely transferring Sophia to the SUV alongside Matthew, a cold, calculating resolve settled over my spirit. The exact mental focus I relied upon when infiltrating dangerous international criminal syndicates. Moving silently like a shadow across the wet grass, I approached the rear entrance of the cabin, easing the unlocked screen door open without making a single sound. Inside, the air reeked of stale whiskey and wood smoke. My father, Dale Hobbs, lay sprawled asleep on a worn leather sofa, an empty bottle resting on the floor beside his heavy leather boots. As I stepped toward the center of the living room, my boot creaked slightly against a loose floorboard. Instantly startling, the 62-year-old Army veteran awake. His eyes opened, wild and bloodshot with alcohol, shifting rapidly from momentary confusion to arrogant fury as he recognized me standing over him in the dark. "Julia, what the hell are you doing here?" Dale growled, his raspy voice thick with sleep, as he lunged violently toward a glass-fronted gun cabinet mounted on the wall. But I was already 3 steps ahead of his move. Drawing upon 12 years of hand-to-hand combat training against armed poachers, I closed the distance instantly, grabbing his outstretched arm, twisting his wrist with leverage, and sweeping his legs out from under him. Dale crashed heavily onto the hardwood floor, gasping for air as I pinned his chest with my knee, pulling heavy-duty nylon zip ties from my tactical bag and binding his wrists and ankles tightly behind his back. "You think you're a hero?" Julia, Dale spat, blood from his split lip staining his gray beard as he thrashed helplessly against the unbreakable nylon restraints. That boy of yours is weak and soft. He needs discipline, or society will break him. Your husband, Richard, agreed with me. Ignoring his bitter rants, I systematically searched his oak desk, pulling out a thick leather binder and opening a steel filing cabinet beside the wall. Inside were detailed contract agreements, payment receipts, and liability waivers signed by desperate, misguided parents who had unknowingly handed their children over to a sadist. My hands shook with profound disgust as I pulled out Matthew's folder, dated just 2 days after I departed for Thailand, bearing my husband Richard's clear, bold signature. He had signed a 60-day contract authorizing physical restraints and isolation to eliminate tears and establish masculine resilience in our 9-year-old son. Beside the filing cabinet hung a large topographical map of the tri-state area, marked with 15 red pushpins, alongside a folder labeled Network Associates, containing names, addresses, and phone numbers of 15 former military buddies operating similar camps across 5 states. Using my smartphone, I photographed every single contract, financial record, and map location, securing the digital evidence needed to dismantle the entire human trafficking ring. Looking down at my father with cold detachment, I stated quietly, "You spent 20 years in the Army believing power comes from cruelty. I'm going to ensure you spend the rest of your life behind federal bars." The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital in Clearfield was eerily quiet when I pulled up to the ambulance bay at 3 o'clock in the morning, carrying Matthew gently in my arms while guiding young Sophia Morrison beside me. The bright fluorescent lights of the triage lobby stung my eyes, but my voice remained razor sharp, calm and commanding as I approached the intake desk. "I need pediatric trauma physicians immediately," I stated with absolute, unyielding authority to the startled charge nurse. "These children have been subjected to prolonged physical torture, severe dehydration, and unlawful restraint. I also require the immediate presence of the County Sheriff's Department and Child Protective Services." The hospital erupted into swift, controlled action as medical staff swept Matthew and Sophia into separate examination rooms. Deputy Kevin Bond, a heavy-set law enforcement officer roused from his overnight shift, arrived shortly after to take my formal statement. As he listened to the harrowing details, I pulled out my smartphone and presented the high-resolution photographs of Dale's contracts, network maps, and financial ledgers. Deputy Bond's initial skepticism evaporated into sheer horror as he scrolled through the evidence documenting a clandestine, multi-state syndicate exploiting vulnerable children under the guise of wilderness therapy. "Jesus Christ," Bond breathed, his face turning pale under the harsh corridor lights. "This isn't just a domestic dispute. This is a massive criminal enterprise. We need to alert federal authorities immediately." Standing in that sterile hallway, watching nurses tend to my son's wounds, I knew our fight for justice had officially begun. Stepping softly into Matthew's treatment room, my heart broke anew at the sight of my sweet 9-year-old boy lying in the massive hospital bed, looking impossibly small beneath the crisp white sheets, while intravenous fluid slowly dripped into his arm. The attending physician Dr. Carolyn Metcalf, informed me that despite his severe dehydration, infected mosquito bites, and deep ankle contusions, his physical body would recover with care. However, the psychological wounds cut far deeper into his tender spirit. The moment Matthew saw me enter, tears instantly welled up in his tired brown eyes, and his fragile face crumpled into sudden, frantic panic. "I'm sorry, Mommy. I'm so sorry," he gasped desperately, his voice trembling as he attempted to wipe his eyes with his bruised sleeve. "I know I'm not supposed to cry. I promise I'll be tougher. Please, don't let Grandpa take me back." I was at his bedside in a heartbeat, gathering his delicate frame gently against my chest, holding him tight as tears overflowed down my own cheeks. "Matthew, look at me, baby," I whispered tenderly, cradling his face. "You never have to apologize for crying." Crying is not a sign of weakness. It is the proof that you possess a gentle, feeling heart that refuses to be hardened by cruelty. Your grandfather was completely wrong. True strength isn't about inflicting pain or suppressing emotion. Genuine empathy and compassion are the greatest human powers in this world. As my words sank in, Matthew buried his face in my neck and wept, releasing 3 days of suppressed terror into my arms. A quiet knock on the door interrupted our peaceful embrace as Deputy Bond entered, accompanied by a sharp-eyed woman in a sharp, dark suit whose commanding posture radiated senior federal law enforcement. "Mrs. Hunt, this is Special Agent Betsy Stafford from the FBI's Crimes Against Children Division," Bond introduced. Agent Stafford got straight to business, her voice brimming with grave urgency. "What you've uncovered at Dale Hobbs' cabin is potentially one of the largest underground child abuse networks in federal history. I need full digital transfers of all those files immediately so our teams can launch coordinated raids across 5 states before these camps shut down." I met her gaze with unflinching resolve, my voice laced with cold, professional steel. "You will receive every byte of data, Agent Stafford, but under one non-negotiable condition. I am joining your operational task force as an active technical consultant." Stafford raised an eyebrow, shaking her head firmly. "You're a victim's mother, Mrs. Hunt. Department policy strictly prohibits civilian involvement." "I am a senior international investigator with 12 years of experience infiltrating armed criminal syndicates across 4 continents. I cut her off with absolute authority. "I speak 4 languages, hold specialized tactical certification in wilderness tracking, and understand my father's psychological profile better than anyone alive. You can utilize my expertise as a consultant, or I will conduct my own parallel investigation, and your agents will be tripping over my tracks at every turn." Stafford studied me intensely for a long moment before nodding grimly, accepting my specialized role on the federal team. Minutes after establishing my consultancy role, Agent Stafford's encrypted tablet chimed with a high-priority alert that sent an icy chill through the command center. An intercepted mass communication from an unknown syndicate number showed an urgent code red broadcast sent to all network associates. "Hobbs' cabin compromised. Initiate containment protocol." Stafford's face turned grim as she analyzed the broadcast. "They are triggering an emergency protocol to move or hide the children and incinerate financial records across all 15 locations. We have to execute immediate tactical raids right now. However, as federal analysts cross-referenced Dale's network files with banking databases, another shocking revelation surfaced regarding my husband, Richard. Agent Stafford pulled me aside into a private consultation room, her expression heavy with sympathy and grave professional concern.
Julia, financial intelligence just tracked your joint bank accounts, Stafford revealed softly. 3 weeks ago, while you were still working in Thailand, Richard embezzled $60,000 from your family savings and transferred the funds into an offshore shell account. The financial theft barely registered compared to the darker truth. Wire logs confirmed Richard had been conspiring directly with Cliff Barrett, Dale's primary partner and a dishonorably discharged former Marine running the network's most fortified compound in West Virginia. Richard hadn't simply been manipulated by my father. He had actively sold out our innocent son and stolen our life savings to fund a sinister escape plan with Barrett. The betrayal was absolute, transforming my husband from a passive coward into an active, calculating perpetrator of criminal conspiracy. As dawn began to break over Clearfield, a commotion near the hallway entrance announced the arrival of my mother, Lois Hobbs. She looked frail, exhausted, and visibly shaken, her face pale with overwhelming horror as she collapsed into a chair, clutching her chest in unbearable grief. "Julia," she wept hysterically, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks as I stepped forward to support her. "The police came to the house. They told me what Dale has been doing at the cabin. I swear on my life I had no idea. He told me he was running a legitimate outdoor leadership retreat for troubled youth. I never visited the property because he insisted it was his private retreat." Looking into her terrified eyes, my investigative instincts confirmed her genuine ignorance. Lois was merely another victim of Dale's lifelong deception and domineering control. However, when I brought up Richard's betrayal, my mother's expression shifted from shock to a heavy, tragic realization. "I should have warned you, Julia," Lois admitted softly, her trembling hands wringing together. "Over the past year, while you were deployed overseas, Richard changed completely. He became cold, resentful, and obsessed with money. He started talking about Matthew with the same harsh contempt Dale used, calling him weak. I thought it was stress from your job, but I see now that Richard had completely lost his soul." Her tragic confession confirmed that the toxic cycle of domestic violence and greed had corrupted Richard long before my return, reinforcing my unyielding resolve to dismantle their network and protect my son forever. By 8 o'clock that morning, the FBI command post established an airtight timeline that completely resolved any conflicting intelligence regarding my husband's true whereabouts. Initial law enforcement chatter had mistakenly suggested Richard was taken into custody near Harrisburg, but Agent Stafford's federal intelligence analysts quickly clarified the operational reality. Local police had merely detained one of Dale's low-level couriers, driving a vehicle registered under Richard's name. In truth, Richard was actively fleeing southwest, racing along interstate corridors toward the heavily fortified, remote West Virginia compound owned by Cliff Barrett, Dale's primary partner and a dishonorably discharged former Marine. This critical timeline correction eliminated any logical inconsistency in our case,
confirming Richard was not sitting inside a local jail cell, but was frantically trying to unite with Barrett before federal agents could close the net around them. Tracking data retrieved from cell tower pings and automated license plate readers showed Richard making desperate, rapid progress toward the Appalachian foothills, fully aware that the downfall of Dale's cabin had ignited a nationwide federal manhunt. Sitting beside Agent Stafford, I studied the real-time satellite telemetry mapping his flight path with cold, analytical focus. My husband was not a confused bystander or a coerced participant swept up in my father's madness. He was a fleeing fugitive, operating in active, calculated partnership with an armed mercenary, driving headlong toward their primary redoubt in the mountains. The operational clarity restored my sense of purpose, ensuring that every tactical movement we executed was built upon verified, rock-solid intelligence. 2 hours later, state troopers intercepted Richard at a dilapidated roadside motel outside the West Virginia border, where he was anxiously waiting for an offshore wire transfer to settle. Instead of allowing federal agents to process him in isolation, I coordinated with Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Vance, the lead federal prosecutor assigned to the case, entering the Stark interrogation room at the county detention facility alongside him. The metallic door clicked heavily behind us, plunging the room into a tense, suffocating quiet. Richard sat at the steel table in a bright orange jumpsuit, his hands handcuffed to an eyelet anchored in the center of the metal surface. He looked disheveled and frantic, his posture slumped in defeat until his eyes locked onto mine. A sudden, ugly surge of defiance flushed across his pale face as he attempted to puff out his chest, hiding his cowardly terror behind a mask of hollow aggression. Prosecutor Vance sat down at the table, opening a thick black leather portfolio containing certified federal warrants and financial seizure orders, while I stood calmly near the observation window, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I watched my husband with the objective, detached gaze of a professional investigator who had spent 12 years analyzing violent criminals in hostile interrogation rooms across the globe. He was no longer the man I had once married. He was a desperate suspect cornered by the irresistible force of federal justice, completely unaware that his pathetic excuses were about to crumble under the weight of hard evidence. The moment Prosecutor Vance began reciting the formal criminal charges, Richard slammed his handcuffed hands against the steel table, his voice cracking with sharp, shameless hostility as he turned his rage directly toward me. "This is all your fault, Julia," Richard yelled, his eyes wild with desperate, manipulative anger. "You were never around. You spent 12 years flying across the world to save wild animals in Asian jungles while your own family fell apart at home. Matthew was turning into a soft, whiny, delicate kid because you weren't here to help raise him. So your father and I stepped in to make him a real man. I did what a father had to do, and now you're ruining my life." I listened to his pathetic rationalizations without flinching, a calm, pitying smile gracing my lips as I stepped up to the table. Opening a manila folder, I laid out 3 sets of pristine financial documents and printed text transcripts directly before his bulging eyes. "Save your self-righteous speeches, Richard," I stated softly,
my voice cold and smooth as silk. This has nothing to do with Matthew's upbringing or my career. This document proves you embezzled $60,000 from our joint savings while I was in Thailand. These printed, encrypted text logs prove you've been having an affair with Cliff Barrett's sister for 8 months, and were planning to abandon our son in that forest forever. You didn't try to save Matthew. You sold him out to fund your own cowardly escape. Cornered by the devastating financial records and undeniable proof of his personal betrayal, Richard's arrogant posture instantly collapsed, replaced by a dark, sinister desperation. He leaned forward across the cold steel table, his eyes narrowing as he attempted to play his final, predatory card against the federal prosecution team. You think you've won, Julia, but you don't know half of what Cliff has built out there, Richard hissed, his voice dropping into a raspy, threatening whisper that echoed off the bare walls. Cliff Barrett isn't some drunk old veteran like your father. He has booby-trapped his entire 48-acre West Virginia compound with military-grade plastic explosives, thermal motion sensors, and deadly tripwires. Furthermore, he has hidden dozens of children in secret underground bunkers scattered across 3 states. Locations that aren't written down on any paper map or stored on any computer server. If you raid his compound, he will detonate the explosives and make those children vanish forever. Foster care records will be altered, missing person reports will be buried, and you will never find them. Richard glared at Prosecutor Vance, pulling against his steel handcuffs with arrogant leverage. Here is my deal. I want full federal immunity from all child abuse, financial fraud, and human trafficking charges for both myself and Barrett. We get safe passage to an offshore jurisdiction, and in return, I will give you the GPS coordinates for those hidden children. If you refuse my terms, those kids stay buried in the dark forever, and their blood will be on your hands. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the interrogation room as Prosecutor Vance glanced at me, assessing the grave strategic weight of Richard's extortion threat. But I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. Stepping close to the steel table, I leaned down until my eyes were mere inches from Richard's pale, sweat-sheened face, radiating an unshakable, diamond-hard resolve born from 12 years of hunting dangerous predators through the darkest corners of the earth. You are making a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that commanded absolute authority in the room. You think you're dealing with an amateur? But I have spent over a decade tracking international poaching syndicates through dense, uncharted jungles spanning thousands of square miles. I have disarmed wire snares, pressure plates, and explosive traps designed by men far more dangerous, ruthless, and intelligent than Cliff Barrett. You and your mercenary partner are not masterminds. You are small-minded, pathetic bullies who exploit defenseless children because you are terrified of real strength. I stood tall, looking down at him with utter, cold contempt as Prosecutor Vance quietly closed his file. We will never negotiate with extortionists, and we will never grant immunity to monsters. We are going to raid Barrett's compound. We are going to rescue
every single child he has hidden, and then I am going to ensure you spend the next 30 years of your life staring at the concrete walls of a federal prison cell. You have nowhere left to run. Covered by the dense cloak of midnight, I traversed 3 grueling miles of rugged, overgrown Appalachian wilderness to reach the high ridge overlooking Cliff Barrett's heavily fortified 48-acre West Virginia property.
Years of tracking elusive poachers through unforgiving Southeast Asian jungles had taught me how to move in complete harmony with the forest, stepping softly across damp pine needles and avoiding dry branches that could betray my position. Reaching a rocky outcrop, I carefully unslung my specialized thermal surveillance drone from my tactical pack, launching the whisper-quiet quadcopter into the dark night sky.
Sitting beneath a canopy of thick oaks, I monitored the high-definition infrared telemetry feed streaming directly to my tablet screen. The heat signatures illuminated the compound with crisp, unambiguous clarity. 3 armed guards patrolling the perimeter dirt roads, 2 heat signatures pacing inside the main house, 6 faint figures huddled closely together on the second floor of the large wooden barn, and 3 distinct heat sources contained within a subterranean concrete bunker built into the hillside. I immediately relayed the precise GPS coordinates and thermal layout to Agent Stafford and the FBI hostage rescue team staged 2 miles back along the ridge. My reconnaissance confirmed that 9 innocent children were currently trapped inside the target area, providing federal operators with real-time tactical intelligence. Sitting in the dark woods, watching the glowing digital screen, every maternal instinct in my body surged with a fierce, protective determination to bring those captive children safely back into the bright light of freedom. Descending the ridge with practiced stealth, I bypassed Barrett's perimeter motion sensors by approaching the wooden barn from its blind eastern rear wall. Using a silent rope ascent technique, I scaled the rough timber siding and slipped quietly through a second-floor hayloft window. Inside, 6 terrified children, ranging from 7 to 13 years old, sat huddled together in a dark corner, linked together by heavy iron leg chains. They recoiled in blind panic until I lowered my night vision goggles and whispered in a gentle, reassuring tone. "I am a mother and an investigator," I whispered softly, pulling out my heavy multi-tool. "I rescued my son from a camp like this last night, and I am here to get all of you out." Their wide eyes filled with overwhelming hope as I methodically picked the industrial padlocks binding their ankles. Freedom restored, I guided them toward the rear ground-level emergency exit, giving them clear, simple instructions. "Run straight into the woods, toward the tree line where the federal agents are waiting to protect you," I instructed gently, holding the brave 11-year-old girl who led the group by her trembling shoulders. "Do not look back, and do not stop until you reach their flashlights." As the 6 children sprinted silently into the protective darkness toward the FBI perimeter, a profound sense of maternal purpose filled my chest. I had freed them from the physical chains of cruelty, ensuring that their young lives would no longer be dictated by fear, domestic abuse, and human malice. Before I could retreat back into the forest shadows, bright halogen floodlights suddenly burst to life across the entire compound, illuminating the courtyard in blinding white glare. Cliff Barrett stepped out from the main house, holding a modified military assault rifle in his right hand
and a heavy, molded plastic electronic transmitter in his left. My traitorous husband, Richard, cowered nervously behind Barrett's muscular frame, glaring toward the dark woods with frantic, desperate terror. "FBI, stay back or I detonate the entire compound!" Barrett roared, his booming voice echoing across the mountain valley as he held up the transmitter. "This is a dead man's switch connected to 60 pounds of plastic explosives wired around the main house and the underground bunker. My thumb is holding down the spring-loaded safety contact. If you shoot me, if you stun me, or if my grip loosens for a single fraction of a second, the circuit closes and everyone dies instantly." From the tree line, Agent Stafford's voice boomed through an amplified megaphone, ordering him to surrender. But Barrett merely laughed with sadistic, arrogant madness. I stood motionless near the barn's shadow, assessing the catastrophic physics of his trap. The dead man's switch operated on open circuit release. Any sudden physical blow or sniper shot that knocked him unconscious would instantly release his hand pressure, detonating the explosives and slaughtering the 3 children trapped in the subterranean bunker. I realized that brute force or tactical snipers would trigger an absolute tragedy. Only precise, specialized intervention could disarm this deadly device safely. Relying on 12 years of field experience disarming tension-released animal snares and violent poacher explosives in international jungles, I understood that I could not simply attack Barrett directly. Drawing a specialized mechanical vice clamp from my tactical belt, a high-strength locking tool engineered to secure heavy-duty wire traps under immense tension, I moved swiftly through the shadows behind his peripheral vision. As Barrett raised his rifle to scream additional demands at the distant FBI line, I burst from the dark corner with blinding speed, closing the 10-foot distance in a fraction of a second. Instead of striking his body, my hands moved with surgical precision, clamping the heavy steel vice tool directly over the dead man's switch held tightly in his left hand. With a sharp, metallic click, the mechanical jaws locked down with 300 pounds of prayer, permanently clamping the spring-loaded safety button in the suppressed position, regardless of his hand movement or physical state. Realizing his explosive trigger was rendered completely useless, Barrett let out a furious, animalistic roar and lunged toward me. But I was already executing a fluid counter-move. Twisting his wrist with structural leverage, I swept his legs out from under him, driving his heavy frame violently into the hard gravel driveway. I pinned his shoulder with my knee, securing his wrists in heavy nylon restraints while kicking his rifle far across the courtyard, completely neutralizing the dangerous mercenary before he could react or recover from my surprise attack. The instant Barrett hit the ground with the switch permanently clamped safe, the FBI hostage rescue team executed a textbook tactical breach, swarming the compound with armored vehicles and flashbang distractors. Federal operators tackled Richard to the gravel as he attempted to crawl beneath a pickup truck, snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists while securing Barrett in federal custody. Team leaders rushed to the subterranean concrete bunker, cutting through the reinforced steel doors and safely liberating the 3 young children trapped inside, bringing them out into the warm morning air. Within 3 hours, coordinated federal strikes triggered by the master files I secured dismantled
all 15 network locations across 5 states, rescuing 47 abused children from remote captivity and placing dozens of corrupt operators under arrest. Standing beside Agent Stafford as paramedics attended to the traumatized children, a deep, restorative calm settled over my spirit. The underground network of systematic abuse, physical torture, and financial greed had been permanently obliterated, its leaders facing decades in federal prison without parole. Looking out at the rain-cleansed Appalachian Mountains as the morning sun broke through the heavy clouds, I knew that our long, agonizing journey through darkness was finally over. We had brought 47 children out of the shadows, breaking the cycle of cruelty forever, and proving that love, courage, and unwavering maternal devotion will always triumph over human evil in this world. 4 weeks later, I sat near the front row of a packed federal courtroom in Harrisburg, watching the final curtain fall upon the criminal syndicate that had terrorized so many innocent children. The presiding magistrate, federal judge Heather Solomon, brought her heavy wooden gavel down with resounding, unyielding authority as she delivered a scathing, landmark sentence that echoed off the high marble walls. Dale Hobbs and Cliff Barrett, you systematically tortured vulnerable children under the fraudulent guise of therapeutic rehabilitation, Judge Solomon declared, her voice ringing with absolute moral clarity through the silent courtroom. You constructed a predatory network of abuse that shattered families, exploited parental trust, and caused severe, long-lasting psychological harm. I sentence both of you to life imprisonment in a maximum security federal facility without the slightest possibility of parole. My father's stoic military posture collapsed completely into defeat, his eyes staring blankly at the polished floor, while Barrett glared toward me with hollow, impotent hatred. Judge Solomon then turned her cold, unyielding gaze toward my husband, Richard. Richard Hunt, you betrayed your own flesh and blood, conspiring to subject your young, innocent son to horrific physical torture while embezzling family funds for your own cowardly escape. You are hereby sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. As the uniformed bailiffs led the handcuffed defendants away in heavy steel chains, the remaining 12 network associates received sentences ranging from 15 to 40 years, marking the absolute, total, and permanent dismantling of their entire human trafficking enterprise. As the courtroom emptied and the heavy oak doors closed behind the convicted perpetrators, a profound, weightless serenity washed over my spirit. For years, I had quietly endured Richard's growing resentment, his passive aggression, and his toxic alignment with my father's cruel ideology, foolishly hoping that my patience and professional achievements could maintain a peaceful home for our son. But standing in the sunlit courthouse corridor, holding my official divorce decree and sole legal custody documents, I formally severed every remaining emotional and legal tie to the man who had sold out his own child for personal gain. I permanently blocked his prison phone access, burned the lingering remnants of our shared past, and closed that dark, painful chapter of my life forever.
The toxic cycle of intergenerational trauma that had haunted my family line for decades ended right there on those courthouse steps. I was no longer a woman trapped between filial duty and marital obligation. I was a liberated mother, standing tall in her unshakable sovereignty, completely free from the shadows of emotional abuse, control, and deceit. Turning away from the courthouse, I stepped out into the crisp autumn air with my head held high, ready to dedicate every single breath of my remaining journey to nurturing, healing, protecting, and empowering the gentle, soft-spoken. To ensure Matthew's complete emotional recovery, I made the conscious, life-changing decision to resign from my demanding overseas field position with the International Conservation Coalition, stepping away from 12 years of continuous international travel, sweltering Asian jungles, and high-stakes surveillance operations against dangerous syndicates. Accepting a specialized work-from-home consultancy role with the FBI's Crimes Against Children division, I secured a rewarding career that allowed me to analyze criminal intelligence, support federal task forces, and protect vulnerable youth across the nation without ever missing another evening with my son. Seeking a fresh, peaceful start far removed from the painful memories of Pennsylvania, Matthew and I relocated to a charming, sun-drenched cottage in Burlington, Vermont, nestled gently between the rolling green mountains and the tranquil shores of Lake Champlain. Surrounded by towering maple trees, fresh mountain air, and a warm, welcoming community, our new home offered the perfect sanctuary for spiritual restoration. Matthew enrolled in a progressive local elementary school where his artistic sensitivity and gentle nature were celebrated rather than mocked by peers. We adopted a golden retriever puppy named Scout, whose joyful energy filled our hardwood living room with constant laughter and warmth. For the first time in 9 years, my life found a peaceful, grounded rhythm, centered around home-cooked meals, quiet evening walks beneath brilliant autumn foliage, and the unconditional safety of our resilient family unit. On a radiant October afternoon, as golden maple leaves drifted softly across our backyard grass, I surprised Matthew with a wooden artist's easel, a professional set of acrylic paints, and a thick, leather-bound sketchbook. His eyes, once clouded with dark terror and lingering pain, lit up with a brilliant golden wonder as his small fingers carefully traced the pristine, textured pages. For months following his ordeal at the cabin, Matthew had struggled with sudden nightmares, lingering anxieties, and a painful habit of apologizing whenever he showed raw emotion. But sitting on the sun-dappled grass beside Scout, who lay contentedly at his feet, Matthew picked up his paintbrush with steady, confident grace, dipping it into vibrant shades of sky blue, sunshine yellow, and deep forest green. I watched softly from the porch as he painted Scout bounding joyfully through a field of bright wildflowers, his face relaxed into a pure, unburdened smile that reached his very soul. The cruel iron shackle marks around his left ankle had faded into faint, silvery lines, replaced by the blossoming, vibrant brushstrokes of his reborn creative spirit. In that quiet, sacred moment, seeing my son fully immersed in the joy of artistic expression, I knew his inner healing
was complete. He was no longer a victim chained to a dark oak tree in the cold rain. He was a thriving, whole artist, creating his own beautiful world of peace and beauty. Walking down the porch steps, I sat beside Matthew on the soft grass, wrapping my arm gently around his shoulders as we admired his finished painting under the warm Vermont sunset. Scout rested his head softly across Matthew's lap, letting out a deep, contented sigh that echoed the profound peace resting upon our home. Matthew turned to me, his brown eyes clear, bright, and filled with deep, unconditional love as he leaned his head against my shoulder. "Mommy," he whispered softly, his voice steady, warm, and sweet. "I'm glad you came home early from Thailand." Tears of pure, overwhelming gratitude welled up in my eyes as I squeezed him tight against my heart. "Me too, buddy," I replied, kissing his forehead with fierce tenderness. "Me too." Looking out over the golden horizon, a deep spiritual realization settled within my heart. Protecting my son had never been just about severing iron chains or putting evil men behind bars. True protection meant defending his sacred right to be gentle, sensitive, and kind in a complicated world. I had broken the generational cycle of violence, creating an unshakable fortress of love, where his tender spirit could bloom without fear. As the evening stars began to twinkle over the mountains, my phone lay silent inside, and I smiled with profound serenity, knowing our future was finally, beautifully, and unconditionally our own forever in this world.